Work began last year on Cobalt Press's new fantasy RPG, Tales of the Valiant. Now the player's guide is finally out, and I've had enough time to read it through and share with you what I've learned. In this video, I'll tell you a little bit about how this game came to be, what it promised, what it delivers, and why you may or may not want to give it a try. We'll talk a little bit about some of the game mechanics and compare and contrast it from D&D 5e. Most of you probably remember last year's scandal over D&D licensing and how Hasbro wanted to restrict the open gaming license on which it's based in a way many found overly aggressive and just generally bad for the hobby and certainly very bad for third-party publishers. Cobalt Press, a major publisher of 5e-compatible books, announced plans to create their own game system and no longer have to tie their fate to Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast. Initially, they called this project Black Flag in a bit of a piratical reference, maybe with some irony, considering these days when we talk about pirates, we're often talking about intellectual property law and the flouting thereof. Now, if this stuff matters to you, there's one important thing to note in all of this licensing talk. Tales of the Valiant is explicitly based on the D&D 5e SRD, or System Reference Document. After last year's licensing scandal, Wizards of the Coast released that SRD under a Creative Commons license, which is far less restrictive than their initial attempt to retool the OGL they had intended to keep using. So it is the case that Tales of the Valiant is still tied to WotC and to the 5e SRD, but Tales of the Valiant itself has been published under Paizo's ORC license, which is presumably even less restrictive. Now, during its development, the Black Flag system achieved a formal name at some point, which is Tales of the Valiant. And of course, the Player's Handbook is now fully released in PDF, with hardbacks coming soon. The Monster Vault is also out in PDF, with plans for a GM guide to be released this September. Let's talk about the game itself. What did Cobalt Press promise us? Well, they wanted something fully compatible with 5e, but also said one of their goals was to, quote, make spellcasting cooler, and to give more options that are interesting to martial classes. Did they accomplish this? To answer that question, we'll take a look at some of the distinguishing features of Tales of the Valiant. You might be wondering if, like D&D, Tales has a default setting. The answer is, not really. The book does mention what it calls the labyrinth and describes it as infinite worlds linked by twisting corridors of magic. So it's basically a more interesting name for the multiverse, which I appreciate because I'm a little tired of D&D's heavy use of the word multiverse anyway. This at least gives it some kind of named fantasy context. Tales of the Valiant doesn't have any kind of morality system to navigate, so you don't have to decide in a mechanic sense whether your character is lawful, chaotic, good, evil, or whatever. This is a little reminiscent of the direction that Pathfinder went with its remastered edition, although while Pathfinder has a bit of a replacement for the alignment spectrum, with instead optional stated moral codes, Tales just avoids it entirely as a formal part of the game mechanic at all. Magic is only slightly different in Tales. Spell levels are renamed circles, presumably to reduce confusion with character class levels. Now spells have a circle rank instead of a level rank, but it amounts to the same thing. In other words, a spell that is, for example, third level in D&D is third circle in Tales of the Valiant, and this is also similar to a Pathfinder remastered change. The available playable core classes are the same as in D&D, but with the addition of the Mechanist class, and that's similar to D&D's Artificer class, but the Mechanist is a core class in the TOV Player's Guide. The subclasses in Tales have slight differences from their equivalents in D&D 5e, but will still feel basically the same to players familiar with D&D. TOV does, though, formalize the idea of subclasses more thoroughly. For example, the fighter's fighting styles are spelled out as formal fighter subclasses in TOV. Similarly, the cleric's domains are actual cleric subclasses. Tales of the Valiant has not races, but lineages and heritages. A lineage is your genetic group, in other words, your fantasy species, like human, elf, dwarf, and so on. A heritage, on the other hand, is the culture you came from. Languages come from heritage, for example, so you could be a human who grew up with dwarves, speaks fluent Dwarvish, and might even have stereotypical Dwarvish behaviors or attitudes, but you have the body and physicality of a human being. Neither lineage nor heritage, though, alter any core ability stats at all, like races do in D&D, and classes don't either. With specific lineages, there are a few interesting differences from D&D. Elves do not have dark vision, but they can see in dim light as if it were bright. Something called Siderians are a parent lineage composed of beings similar to Aasimars or Tieflings, while Small Folk is one lineage which both gnomes and halflings belong to. Tales of the Valiant doesn't have half-orc or half-elf player character lineages, but it does have a playable full-orc lineage. It also has 2 core lineages that have no analog in core D&D, which are the Beastkin and, of course, the Kobold. I mean, they kind of had to put that one in, right? Tales of the Valiant has a fairly sophisticated system of talents, which are similar to D&D feats. I didn't take a full inventory and compare them, but it seemed to me there were more feats available in Tales than there are in 5e D&D. And they just seem a little more important in this game too. For example, you get a talent when you choose a background. Weapons in this game can have something called options, which are special capabilities. For example, a weapon with the pinning shot option has the potential to immobilize a creature that is hit with it. Unlike D&D, where magic items are listed in the DM guide, the Tales of the Valiant Player's Guide includes a pretty full list. It also has a section on fabled magic items, incorporating something already present in Kobold supplements such as the Vault of Magic. Fabled magic items have abilities based on the wielder's level, so the item grows along with the character who's using it. One of the most notable differences from D&D is the luck mechanic. Where D&D has inspiration, with a maximum of 1 inspiration per character, Tales of the Valiant has luck. The maximum luck a character can have is 5, and luck can be spent in different amounts to do different things. You can spend luck as a 1-for-1 bonus to any check. So, for example, you could spend 2 luck to add a +2 to any check. You can also spend 3 luck once to reroll a d20 after a check, similar to how inspiration works in D&D. Whenever you miss an attack roll or fail a save, you automatically gain a luck point. So there's a nice bit of balancing to a bad run of actual dice luck. But like inspiration, the GM can also award luck points to players for whatever reason, like good roleplay, a witty remark, or, I don't know, getting up and getting a beer for the GM so they don't have to. Now here's a really interesting thing too. If you get more than 5 luck, then you must roll a d4 and reset your luck number to that result. And this is intended to encourage players to actually use their luck points rather than forget about them or just sit on them. The Player's Guide mentions something it calls dread, and it describes it like this. When PCs witness terrors beyond mortal comprehension, they might be inflicted with dread. Dread goes beyond standard fear. It is severe psychological harm that can scar a creature for minutes or indefinitely until magic intervention is used. But there isn't much more detail and no game mechanics are presented for this. It sounds to me a little like the optional sanity mechanic in D&D, and maybe we'll see it elaborated more in the GM guide when that comes out. I don't have the Monster Vault book, so I don't know if it might be elaborated on in monster listings as an effect there, though. Spells work pretty much exactly as they do in 5e, but they formally list out 4 official sources of magic: arcane, divine, primordial, and weird. Arcane and divine are what they are in D&D, while primordial is the source of druidic and ranger magic, and weird is the source of warlock magic. This doesn't seem to have much game rule significance yet, but it's an interesting way of quantifying beyond just arcane and divine magic. Well, those are all the significant characteristics and differences from D&D that stood out to me. Otherwise, this game is pretty much 5e as we know it, with the details being distinct, but the big picture being basically the same. So why might you want to play Tales of the Valiant? Well, one reason that might motivate you is the simple fact that it's not a Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast product. A lot of D&D players have become sour on Hasbro over several unpopular decisions and moves by the company in the past couple of years. So if you want something really similar to D&D, which is extremely compatible with other third-party 5e supplements, this might just be the most solid choice you can make. In terms of combat rules, for example, Tales of the Valiant is more similar to D&D than even Pathfinder. If cutting ties with Hasbro is important to you, though, it's worth noting that this game is based on the 5e SRD, so it's still coupled with D&D in at least that sense. But for some, this might just be distance enough while still providing a really similar experience. Now, I have heard some summarize it as a crunchier system than D&D 5e, but I'm not sure why they say that. Personally, I saw only very minor differences in complexity, most notably the weapon options. To me, it felt about the same as D&D in this way, neither simpler nor more complex. But this wasn't something Kobold really promised about the game either. I'm just addressing a common description that I've seen. So let's try to answer the question of whether Tales of the Valiant delivers what Kobold Press promised. Well, one of the promises was more interesting combat options for martial classes like the Fighter. On my read-through, I didn't really see much of that. Those classes are effectively the same as their D&D counterparts with minor differences in the detail. The only thing I noticed that might make things a little more interesting for a straightforward fighter type were the weapon options. I have the same reaction to spellcasting classes too. Kobold said the game would make spellcasting cooler, but I'm not sure anything in this book really does that. Again, it seems about the same as the spellcasting system in D&D. So in my opinion, the book doesn't really fulfill on those promises, but it is an interesting game system, and one I think is worth giving a shot if you're curious. Although I've called the class and lineage differences minor, I mean that in the sense that they don't change the 5e SRD in any significant or noteworthy ways to make it truly feel like a completely different game. But the nuances of those changes might prove a nice break from playing 5th edition D&D for 10 years now, as many of us have. If you want to shake things up a little bit but not hit too bad of a learning curve, Tales of the Valiant might be the way to go for you. And that's the rundown on Tales of the Valiant Player's Guide. If you've also given it a look, leave a comment and let me know what you thought. And also leave a comment if you noticed something I got wrong or missed, or if you have more information. I always enjoy the constructive feedback. And for game mechanics talk, check out my video about misconceptions and overlooked rules in D&D, linked at the bottom of your screen right now. And thank you for watching.